Hello and welcome to our fourth video in our series on monetary economies. In this video, we're going to sketch a very simple model of the money market, but this model is actually going to be quite useful for us in order to determine the main aspects of the money markets that we're going to carry through into our larger model. That's going to be in the next video. And so the idea, remember, is a simple model where we can get all the moving pieces and understand the intuition of what's going on, and not necessarily to capture all aspects of reality. So what's the idea behind this simple model? We're going to have that consumers and firms need to conduct transactions. This is a fact. They need to buy and sell goods and services. In order to do so, they need to transact between them. And they're going to have in the model two ways of making those transactions. They can either use cash or use credit cards. The main distinction between these two is if you use your credit card, you can leave your money in the bank or say your money in a bond, and then at the end of the credit cycle, you can cash in after you get your interest and pay for your credit card before the credit card charges you interest. But if you do it with cash, you cannot do that. If you pay with cash, then that money wasn't in the bank or wasn't in the bond, and so you don't get the interest rate. Now, banks offer credit card services, but this is costly for them. And so they will offer credit card services at some real price that we're going to call QC. This is kind of unfortunate because we used to have a Q in the previous video for the price of the zero coupon bonds. This is a totally different Q, okay? This is the Q of the credit cards, hence the C, okay? QC is the price of using a credit card. Now, consumers need to choose between demanding cash or credit cards, and this is what's going to be called the demand for liquidity. So how much demand is there for the very liquid asset, so for cash, as opposed to the total demand for transactions that's going to be covered by both cash and credit cards. Now let's first talk about the supply of credit card services. What we have here is that if X is the number of transactions carried out with credit card services, and Q, so here we have both X in the horizontal axis and Q in the vertical axis. As Q is higher and the price for credit card services is higher, then the amount of real transactions, the amount of goods that can be transacted with credit cards is going to be higher. The banks are willing to provide more of them. That's basically what this supply function is saying. Now, what's important here, though, is that Q is the real price of a credit card service per transaction. So you can think of this that in the real world, most credit cards have an annual fee. And you can think of dividing that fee across all the different numbers of transactions that you have. That's going to give you a price per transaction. That's going to be Q. And we're going to measure Q in units of goods. Now, where is the demand for credit coming from? Well, it's basically the decision of consumers of whether they want to pay with credit card or they want to pay with cash. So what's in that decision? Say you want to buy 1 unit of consumption good, so 1 consumption good, and you have 2 choices. If you do it with a credit card, then you have to pay P, that's going to be the price of your good, but then you also have to pay for the transaction cost of using the credit card, that's QC. So you have to add the QC to the cost. That's going to give a total cost of P times 1 plus QC. If you use cash, then you have to pay the same price P, the good costs the same, and you also have to take into account the opportunity cost of using cash. And we already alluded to this. The opportunity cost of using cash is not storing the money in the bank or in a bond. So you are not receiving the interest rate that the money will have gotten if it had remained in the bank. And so once you take into account the opportunity cost of using money, you get that the cost of using money is going to be P times 1 plus R, the nominal interest rate. Now, the decision of whether to use credit cards or to use money, it's then going to be depending on which one is cheaper. That's what we're going to do next. If the cost of using the credit card is lower than the cost of using cash, that's going to happen if QC is less than R, then it's better to use the credit card. If, on the other hand, you will rather use cash if the cost of using the credit card is higher, that's the second case. So what you find from this is that demand is perfectly elastic at a price QC equal to R. Basically, at that price, consumers are indifferent between using either credit cards or cash. And we can see that in our diagram as a horizontal line. That's going to be the red line that starts at the level R. That's going to be the equilibrium demand. And so we find that the equilibrium is going to depend on the nominal interest rate. A higher nominal interest rate, it's going to make it more costly for consumers to use cash. And so the demand for credit card services is going to increase, is going to shift up. And so is the quantity of credit card services is going to also shift up. But it's important to understand that the equilibrium here of how much credit card services are demanded in equilibrium not only depends on R, it also depends on the technology that's available. Because as we find technologies that make offering credit card services cheaper, that's also going to shift the supply curve. Basically, if it's cheaper for them, that's going to look like a shift downwards of the supply curve, and that's going to increase the equilibrium quantity of credit card services at the same interest rate. So what have we learned from this? Well, we know how much X is there in equilibrium, but we actually wanted to know the demand for money. So how do we go from X to the demand for money? Well, there is a total of Y real transactions in the economy. Y is total output. All output has to be transacted between somebody and somebody else. And so we know that there is a total number of real transfers, of real transactions, Y. Then X of them, and that X is going to depend on the nominal interest rate, it's going to depend on credit card services. So the remaining Y minus X are transactions that are carried out with cash. And the demand for money is the total amount of money required to conduct all those transactions. So that's why you're multiplying by P. And so from these, we can actually see the three main properties of money demand. The first one is if prices are higher, but you still are carrying the same number of transactions, then you just demand more money because you just need more money in order to conduct those transactions at a higher price. If Y is higher, output is higher, there are more transactions happening in the economy. And if there are more transactions happening, you also need more money because you need to satisfy all that additional demand of how you're going to conduct those transactions. And finally, if the interest rate goes up, demand for money, it's going to go down. The demand for liquidity is going to go down because it's better to use alternative means for those transactions rather than to use cash. And so that's basically the lesson. And even though in general we don't have this very simple case of like the credit card versus cash, the lessons we learn from these are actually applicable more generally to how money demand works. And so we generally write money demand in two terms. P, the level of prices, times the demand for real liquidity. So we call this L function the demand for real liquidity. And the same as in the previous slide, the key for this L function is if you have more transactions, if Y is higher, then you want more money. So the demand for real liquidity depends positively on output. And if the interest rate is higher, then you want less real liquidity. That's basically it. After we do this, we can use the approximation to the Fisher equation to write the nominal interest rate as R plus I. And we can actually approximate this very well by just taking into account the little r, that's the real interest rate, because most advanced economies have very stable and low inflation. The fact that inflation is so low and so stable means we can basically ignore it when taking this into account, and we know that the nominal interest rate is going to move together with the real interest rate. And this is actually the demand function that we're going to carry through to our large model that we're going to see in the next video. So just to recap, money demand is going to depend on two things. The demand for real liquidity, that's depending on the size of the economy and the real interest rate. And the second thing is the prices that are going to tell us how much money we need to cover those transactions. In the next video, we're going to take these insights and we're going to incorporate them into the intertemporal model that we have developed in our second module.